right. Well, thank you all for joining for today's webinar, um, which is entitled Why Buyers Are Choosing Mineralization Carbon Removals. We've got a great panel. I'll let you each introduce yourself, as I think that's probably better. You can give a little bit of your bio, but let me start with you, Reilly.
Hey, Scott, thanks so much. Good to be here. I'm Reilly. I'm Google's commercial lead for carbon removal. So very practically, that means that I find and fund some of the most promising innovations to pull carbon from the atmosphere and fix the climate. Good to be here.
Thanks, Reilly. Lauren, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Lauren Wylie, Global Head of Sustainability and Social Impact for Oliver Wyman. So we're a strategy consulting firm, and while our partners are out there working with our clients around the globe, I am making sure that we walk the talk on the commitments that we're making to sustainability, to societal commitments, fully focused internally and in charge of our net zero commitment and actioning that.
Wow, that's great. Thank you very much, Lauren. And Santhosh, over to you.
Hey Scott, hi everyone. Thanks. It'd be great to be in this panel and thanks for hosting it. My name is Santhosh Shankar. I'm a managing director at Artemeter. We are a carbon investment manager. We invest into various carbon crediting and decarbonization projects across the globe. In specific, I'm in charge of the carbon markets and the carbon removals technologies that we invest into and make sure that we put money behind technologies that create both an outside environmental and a financial impact. Thank you.
Thanks, Santhosh. And I'm Scott Eaton. I'm your host. I'm the CEO of Carbonplace, which is a transaction and settlement network owned by 9 banks. So with that, let me go ahead and start. The first question, Santhosh, direct at you. And to help contextualize today's conversation, and especially for those who are new to mineralization, can you please give a brief overview on the science behind this process? And maybe as part of that overview, could you also compare and contrast mineralization to some other mainstream CDR project types like DAC or enhanced rock weathering?
Sure, absolutely. So mineralization is a form of drawing down the CO2 from the atmosphere and locking it into minerals or compounds, which are almost permanent. So they're not going to release the CO2 back into the atmosphere unless they are exposed deliberately to very high temperatures or highly acidic environments. So in many ways, you can assume that the CO2 that's drawn down is typically a permanent CO2 sequestration. So what happens in various of our industries today, especially heavy industries like iron and steel, they form a lot of byproducts or waste product streams, which have a lot of CO2 loving chemicals in them, in the sense that when these chemicals are exposed to the atmosphere, they have a natural affinity to draw down the CO2 in the air and lock them into these minerals, thereby creating the carbon removals. But left to itself, this thing can typically take many years or probably even many more longer decades, for example. So in specific, companies which are doing the superficial mineralization today, specifically like carbonatic that we may be speaking to, what they do is they co-locate with these industries and have their operations within these industrial sites. They co-locate with the industries who own these byproduct streams. Then they process these byproducts, thereby typically crushing them, making them into smaller granules, thereby exposing more of the surface area to the atmosphere to enhance the CO2 drawdown that would happen. And then with various aeration techniques, they further enhance the CO2 drawdown that could occur into these materials. Thereby taking this process, which would have taken probably decades for the CO2 drawdown to happen, to typically a couple of weeks, by which time this material would be completely carbonated and would draw down a lot of CO2. So this is what typically a superficial mineralization companies do. There are other forms of mineralizations as well, like enhanced rock weathering or in situ mineralization. But in general, they kind of follow the same science of essentially locking in CO2 into these minerals or carbonates typically, which are very permanent ways of sequestering CO2.
Thanks. It's very interesting. And I love the idea that it actually can happen fairly quickly, which is intriguing to me, given a lot of the other processes that are out there. Reilly, let me ask you, at Google, you lead carbon removal commercialization, as you mentioned. Can you tell us about your team's core objectives and how project types like mineralization are currently fitting into that broader strategy?
Yeah, of course. And maybe to kick off, I'll give some of the context, like you said, of what our team is working towards, and then it will be fairly easy to understand how and why mineralization fits within that program's set of principles. But in short, our team's mandate is to help Google hit its climate goals by managing our residual emissions in whatever way most helps the planet fix the atmosphere. So like I said before, very practically, that means finding and then funding the solutions that undo the impact of carbon and other greenhouse gases on the atmosphere. So our team does this across a few different domains, let's call them. So it really kicked off with co-founding Frontier back in 2022, the advanced market commitment for engineered carbon removal, as a way to send the clearest demand signal for innovative technologies and catalyze the next generation of solutions to remove and permanently store carbon. Last year, we expanded the portfolio to include nature. So we co-founded the Symbiosis Coalition, which is committed to bringing the best of data, science, and practice to raise the quality bar of nature-based carbon removal and using natural processes. And then earlier this year, we further expanded the tools in the toolkit to include super pollutant elimination, or technologies that tackle non-CO2 greenhouse gases that are significantly impacting near-term warming. The through line between these three, let's call them pillars or three areas of work, are two principles. So first is that we're seeking solutions that have high certainty of climate impact, and we're seeking solutions that have high scale of climate impact. So on the certainty side, what we really mean is that we want to be confident that the impact actually happened so that we can measure it, that it won't be undone, and that it wouldn't have happened without our actual intervention. And on the scale side, it's really just a question of the size of impact going up and then the cost coming down over time. We're going to need to deliver tremendous volume at low prices so that we can actually make a dent in a problem that is denominated in the billions of tons of CO2. So for me, mineralization is exciting because I think it has the potential to score pretty well on both of those pillars. So to provide both high certainty and high scalability of climate impact. So on the certainty side, many mineralization solutions are pretty straightforward because we can, like Santhosh said, actually measure the amount of CO2 that a material has stored. And we can be reasonably certain about the conditions under which that material might release the CO2 back, which can give us confidence that the impact actually happened and that it'll persist under the right conditions. On the scale side, we find it exciting because mineralization takes the best of both existing natural processes and existing industrial processes to potentially unlock tremendous volume at low cost. So it's really a sweet spot where we can take the best of what nature has to offer with regards to how it can draw down CO2, and then unleash it in industries that are really, really good at moving lots of material really, really cheaply. And so we think with those two ingredients, it really has the potential to scale. And maybe I'll just say, like, there are many solutions that we're going to need. Mineralization is going to be one tool in the toolkit. Many of them we've discovered today, like Santhosh was saying. We know about ERW, we know about BECCS, we know about DEC, or direct air capture, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And there are many, many more that are likely going to come into the fore in the coming years and decades. But for now, mineralization seems pretty well poised to achieve both the high certainty and the high scale that we'll need to truly fix the atmosphere.
Thanks. And I guess, sorry, just a quick, make sure that I'm still thinking about this right. It's also that ability to easily measure the result, right? Because it's a fairly simple, at least conceptually for me, for the idiot in the room, fairly easy to figure out how it's happening. And so I would assume, therefore, easy to measure, and therefore that adds to that certainty concept.
Yeah, of course. I think different pathways will have different requirements on the measurement side. But from a very simple perspective, if you can measure a material before it's drawn down CO2 and after it's drawn down that CO2, fairly easy to understand the quantum as the impact that you're having. It has come from the atmosphere. Of course, we can complicate, and we'll need to complicate for accurate quantification. There are many other factors at play, but in its simplest form, pre and post measurement to understand the amount of CO2 pulled from the atmosphere is really exciting from a certainty of climate impact perspective.
Thank you. Lauren, let me turn to you. You're doing a lot of work across Oliver Wyman to drive both impact and awareness across a number of verticals, as you kind of alluded to in your opening. can you give us an overview of this work and what it specifically looks like in carbon? I think we'd also like to hear about Oliver Wyman's climate leadership portfolio, which last year made a 3-year pre-purchase commitment in Carbonetic, which is a North American mineralization company.
Yeah, and I think it's what's interesting about, having Reilly on here and having me on here, I think is emphasizing what the most important takeaway should be in that there's a place for everyone in this market. And it's my view that we all need to start getting in there and helping to scale it in whatever way makes sense for us as a company. So we're a small emitter, right? I mean, we travel, we're consultants, it's business travel. Uh, we don't have a massive amount of emissions that we need to be planning ahead to be able to remove in the future. We don't have to have that forward-looking approach on the scale that a Google would, but we believe we should. And so the way that we look at it is that we want to bring this conversation about carbon removal out from these sustainability webinars and rooms into living rooms and boardrooms. And how do we do that? That's really looking for solutions that are simple to understand, as you said, Scott, right? I mean, mineralization is when it boils down to it, I remember when I first kind of got it, it was a real, oh, I get that. And you really need this in this very confusing and nascent space. So at Oliver Wyman, basically what we did was we looked at where our emissions are, its travel, and we put an internal price on carbon for air travel that is tied to executive compensation. Right there, we're focused on decarbonizing first and foremost, and every company should be doing that. But then understanding that we wanted to look more broadly into how to action our commitment before we were really on the hook to with our parent company's net zero commitment, we said let's sort of take a look at what our footprint was and let that amount inform something we're going to put out there into the world in the form of scaling carbon removal and finding ways to educate our employees and our broader networks about that. So that came in the form of our climate leadership portfolio that really has that two-pronged goal of having catalytic impact on the companies that we work with, while also enabling education of our staff and our networks.
I love because for me, I keep coming back to this idea that this one's really simple conceptual understanding. And I suspect that, in trying to promote this through that education layer that you were just saying, it helps when you can start with just something that's conceptually easy, and then you can go on to explain or go into as much depth as anyone would need or want. Thank you. So let me actually turn to you again and Reilly as well. How do you both think about the cost of carbon dioxide removal, right? So CDR, hundreds of dollars per ton of removal is probably prohibitive for many buyers. And Lauren, as you highlighted, right? You're not Google, you're Oliver Wyman. How do you get your CFOs comfortable buying CDR at these price levels? And does the scalability potential of a project type like mineralization help advance those conversations?
Yeah. For us, we're looking at filling gaps, right? So perhaps where Google has come in and gotten us here, but a project might need to be here. Is there a room for us to be catalytic in getting them over the finish line? That could be a reason why we choose a company to support. But really, for us, the price is not the driving criteria for us. There's all of the important ones like the durability and scalability is a big one, but also the accessibility to the story of what is happening on the ground, to the actual project. We want to learn and we want the visibility. So a company like ours is probably not going to be having a need to look at a big registry and put together a massive portfolio. We care about choosing one or two. How can we have catalytic impact? And what the price is, to answer your question, is it is what it is, right? And because it's a very unique position I am in because my parent company, we are carbon neutral through our parent company, Marsh McLennan. We buy offsets, removals, avoidance. Every year we achieve carbon neutrality certification through a third party. So I'm not matching emissions against purchases. This is fully contribution in addition to that. So that is why it's more about what that impact is going to be to the environment and to that particular company versus what is it going to cost for us. So it is a unique position, but it's just an example of how a smaller company like ours is trying to find those areas where we can go in and have that impact in a way that maybe looks small to the outsider, but when you're actually that project that desperately needs it, it's a game changer. And that's
Mm.
how we looked at our relationship with Carbonetic that we partnered with Artemeter on.
Yeah, actually, that makes sense. And that opportunity for impact is quite telling because, as we all know, in this particular industry, um, those project developers are usually struggling in those early stages. So having that opportunity to have impact. Reilly, how do you think about that question?
Yeah, from our side, I think just to echo something Lauren said is that the first order thing that we're trying to achieve, and the reason why I led with certainty of climate impact, is really because we need to ensure that the impact is actually happening and that what we're funding is incredibly high quality. So I think any conversations about scale, about costs, necessarily start from, do we know we're funding the most high quality thing? And then if we do, from there, what are the different ways that we can try to unleash this industry through making sure that it can scale? So hold quality constant. But when it comes to costs, I think for me, what I often try to do is think through what's actually needed to solve the challenge at hand. So I mentioned before that this is a billions of ton problem. The estimate often cited is that we'll need something like 10 billion tons of carbon removal annually by 2050 in order to hit our climate goals. So at $100 a ton, that means that the world is going to need to spend $1 trillion per year to stay within our climate goals, which is the equivalent of building the entirety of the oil and gas industry from a revenue perspective, but in reverse. And at $200 a ton, that's the equivalent of building the entire US technology industry. So the scale of the challenge means that we need to figure out ways to make this affordable so that the world can actually achieve what it has to achieve. And so I think the more expensive carbon removal remains, we'll still need to do it. The challenge doesn't disappear. The only constant in this world, or one of, the only constant is change, but another constant is climate change. But the more expensive it remains, the harder it's going to be to hit our targets. And so I think from the buyer perspective, especially in these early years, it's incredibly important for us to be highly rigorous in finding the most scalable solutions. So like that's the challenge at hand. But I think luckily there are some shortcuts that exist that we all know about that can help drive down costs. So on the one hand, innovation will certainly bring down costs. I think we've already seen the cost curve come down both within technological pathways, but across them just in the last 5 years since a lot of the carbon removal purchasing kicked off. But I think that we can also leverage other lessons from other industries. So we can use waste materials. We can integrate with existing industries like mining or waste, or we can find pathways and deploy in such a way that ensures additional benefits beyond the carbon removal, like energy production or agricultural gains. And then, of course, we'll likely need to go deep into the geochemical world and try to find even more solutions that aren't mainstream or on our radar yet. But I think, zooming out a little bit, it makes sense, right, that we're talking about mineralization in the context of what scales, because it does check a lot of those boxes: waste materials, existing industries, having other benefits. But I think from sort of where we then direct our efforts and what shots we take, it's certainly dictated by what is the size of the prize in the future. So what do our actions today unlock in terms of what's possible in the next 5, 10, 25 years? And for us, I think the ability to holding quality constant bring on solutions that will be the long tent poles in the portfolio in 2050 is, the reason why we're out here, the reason why we're buying, the reason why we're talking about mineralization.
Oh, and I think you both make a really interesting point too, because when you think about that cost needing to come down, right? The reality is in a macroeconomic environment like the one we live in today, that cost gets passed on either to your clients, to consumers generally, to taxpayers. Figure out what the mechanism is, but it usually comes down to people having to pay. We know that that's an unpleasant thing, so we need to drive that cost down. I like the way you guys both think about it, and the fact of getting involved early actually helps drive that, and you help identify those things which are both scalable, but also scalable where it's likely that the cost will come down over time. And then, if you think about it on a, I don't know, years that the carbon is sequestered divided by the cost, or cost divided by the years it's sequestered, you're like, okay, well, actually, this is quite cheap. But no, I think that's very interesting. Santhosh, let me turn to you. Because related to all this, when we talk about scalability and everything else, there's also questions about deliverability. So how do you think about deliverability risks in CDR, right? There seems to be no end in potential CDR solutions, but currently there's a massive short supply in issued assets versus buyer demand. Do you think there's a lower deliverability risk in mineralization versus others?
Yeah, maybe to answer your last question first, yes, definitely we think that's a lower deliverability risk in mineralization, but I would love to kind of add more color to that. So yeah, delivery risk is very real, and we have seen this many companies in the recent past kind of shutting shop, even though they have these huge contracts with many of these technology players, huge offtake demand contracts, forward contracts, but still they're not being able to deliver into these contracts. And so this is kind of becoming a very real thing. And this is very important to understand because not only from an investment perspective, yes, delivery risk is a big thing from an investment perspective, but also from being able to realize that scale and certainty that Reilly was talking about. And if you're not able to deliver, then well, it's pretty much end of the game there. We look at delivery risk across three broad verticals. When you look at any CDR technology, it's kind of the capital needs for the project. Second one is the energy and utility needs. So I say utility specifically because a lot of these technologies also rely not only on energy, but also on other resources like water, for example, which we have to think about. And then the third one is, of course, the policy support and, the subsidy support that the technologies rely on to kind of scale. Are they heavily reliant on some of these policies? And, in the absence of these policies, will they not be able to deliver, for example? So when you look at these three kind of categories for delivery risk, you automatically start looking at what's happening today, and you can kind of see why things are happening the way they're happening. So certain things like data capture is amazing technology, great quality of carbon removals, for example. But these are typically high capex projects. These are like hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of projects. So these are typically very capital intensive, capital high projects, which need massive industries to kind of come behind them to be able to help them scale. And where we have seen like a lot of delivery risk or like people not able to deliver into this contract is essentially because they're not being able to gather that kind of capital and industry support to put these plants in operations which are very capital heavy. And the second one is around the energy and utility, for example. So again, things like data capture typically need energy for working, and there was a rhetoric maybe 5-10 years ago that there's going to be a lot of excessive clean renewable power that's going to be available within the next 10 years. And then we saw the AI boom happen, and now everyone is like going behind renewable power. It's really hard to come by. So when you look at, do you have cheap and renewable power available? Probably not as much for CDR technology. So when we look at many technologies, not just DAC, but other technologies as well, which kind of need this energy to run these facilities, then we see that as a critical kind of a bottleneck that these technologies need to figure out before they can really scale and deliver. The third one is, of course, the policy support. So a lot of technologies, especially on the CCS side of things, kind of relied on favorable policies and favorable tax incentives and favorable permitting landscape. That if you're doing a sequestration of carbon dioxide, for example, in the US, you need the Class 6 permitting or Class 2 permitting, and then there were a lot of hype around whether these things are going to happen much faster than what people anticipated. But no, I mean, these are taking some time, and it's become faster than what it was 5 years ago, but these are still taking time and long lead items to get a well-drilled, a Class 6 well-drilled and permitted for CO2 sequestration. So we see that these are also like contributing to delivery risk in many of these technology categories. And this is where we kind of see, CDR technologies like biochar, for example, or mineralization, probably having the right constructs, the right intrinsics to be able to excel and scale up in deployment in the current landscape, right? Because these technologies, when you look at it, they're not very capital intensive. They can be like really scaled up modularly. Like you can, put multiple trains with slow $10-20 million capex. You can start building it like a Lego block, for example. So you don't need to inject $1 million in year one or in year two for these to kind of take shape. Second one is the energy. So most of these technologies, including BECCS, they go down the energy hill in the sense they don't need energy to facilitate the CO2 drawdown. They actually happens by default, right? Yes, you don't need energy to kind of maintain the balance of the plant, to run your tractors or whatever it could be, like other equipment in your facility. But the CO2 drawdown itself happens typically in energy downhill method, so they don't need injection of extra energy into this process. And third one is, yes, these have kind of typically not relied on permitting or some constraining permitting or policy needs in the landscape, and so they have been able to take off even in different political environments, be it what it may. They've been able to take off as long as there's a voluntary demand and there's a buyer on the other end. These technologies have been able to scale in this market. And these will potentially scale more when there are policy tailwinds, definitely. But even with kind of the headwinds, these have been relatively resilient to compare to many other technologies, and hence have been able to deliver into contracts.
Yeah, that is interesting, and it's obviously we live in changing times. So key that it doesn't rely in the first instance on policy changes. Plus, I like that notion of downhill energy, right? Effectively not requiring additional energy input. Because exactly as you say, what is it? Jivan's paradox. Is it as energy gets cheaper, use goes up. Well, now we add AI, use is going through the roof. So it's exactly as you say. I find that very interesting. Thank you for that. Lauren, let me turn to you for a second, or actually, sorry, let me think. Let me think. Let me turn to you, Reilly. How do you think about weighing permanence, durability, and cost when evaluating projects like mineralization versus cheaper nature-based solutions like ARR? And in fact, I know you mentioned that you're looking across the spectrum. So how do you think about this?
Yeah, of course. And maybe before jumping into that, clearly I've enjoyed trying to distill all of our work into, couples, so certainty and scale. I like Santhosh's sort of distillation into use as little land as possible and use as little energy as possible, and chances are you'll have a good approach to carbon removal. I know you added some more flavor in there, Santhosh, but I like those 2 points. So relatively similar to what I've been saying and what Santhosh has been saying, but we try to boil it down to really be as simple as possible. And when we think through our impact, when we think through permanence and durability and comparing across different pathways, what we really try to do is just look at what's actually happening in the atmosphere when CO2 or other gases are emitted. So when CO2 is emitted, it really does two things. It has both a warming impact, so there's a bump in warming, and there's a time duration. So it stays in the atmosphere for a really, really long time, something like thousands of years. So whatever solutions we fund, it needs to undo the impact that CO2 is actually having on the atmosphere, that full amount. So if a ton of CO2 went up and it would have stayed there, we need to support solutions that take it back out, undo the warming, and keep it out for the full time duration. Temporary solutions like superpollutant elimination or nature-based solutions, they are incredibly important because they solve what is, one part of that challenge, the warming. They help us undo a really, really challenging part of climate change, which is peak warming in the relative near term. Mineralization and other engineered 1,000-year plus durability technologies that remove CO2 and keep it out of the atmosphere for the full duration, they solve the other really important aspect. They solve the long-term drawdown. So from our perspective, if we fund near-term solutions, which we do, it doesn't mean that our work is done. We will still have to somehow replace that impact as it expires. If it's methane or refrigerants, maybe it expires over decades. If it's nature-based, maybe it expires over decades or centuries. But still, ultimately, we'll have to account for the 1,000-year time duration of CO2 and find ways to replace that impact with long-duration carbon removal. And so I think mineralization, like a few other pathways, this is where it really shines, and that you can do you can undo rather, the full impact of that CO2 from the start. So if we can get volumes up and costs down now, you don't have to replace impact as it expires. We can have that permanent impact right from the start. So I think it serves a very important purpose, which is that sort of one-to-one undoing of CO2 that goes up into the atmosphere. And so the faster that we can ramp up volumes to both solve the near-term warming and the long-term drawdown, if we can do that with solutions that do it from right out the gate, that's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, and it's interesting you talk about that needing to redo or reload, if you will, for those that are shorter duration. I'd heard something this morning on, I think it was on the BBC, about for the first time ever in Australia, they're finding that the forests there are not capturing as much carbon because the trees are dying and decaying faster than they had anticipated. So exactly that need to continually address that, I think, is interesting. Lauren, Oliver Wyman's purchasing is currently based on a contribution model, as you mentioned, versus an offset claim. What percentage of your corporate purchases are in the form of more expensive removals, and how has that evolved over time?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer that a couple ways. I mean, when you look at the parent company offsetting portfolio that we do annually, carbon neutral certification, that follows the more traditional, Oxford principles process, right? Where and I started back in 2019. I did this just for Oliver Wyman, where we jumped into the offset market and looking at avoidances. I mean, just learning, right? This is also new. And at the time, I was a team of one. So, I needed help. I needed to go externally and find some trusted partners to teach me. And that was the whole point. And so I look at carbon offsetting as, and that first step we did back then is jumping into the pool, right? Knowing that we'd have a long way to swim. And fortunately, the parent company, Marsh McLennan, was able to take that the next year and say, yeah, that looks good. We need to do that for the full global enterprise. And so that went to them. They transact that now every year. And over time, they have now taken that since 2021. They're up to about 26% in carbon removal purchases, and growing. That's that strategy following the traditional Oxford principles pathway. At Oliver Wyman, this additional climate leadership portfolio approach, it's tough to answer because it's not only credits that we're investing in. So we do have probably the bulk, I would say, 2/3 of our portfolio is doing these long-term agreements, or in the beginning we did spot purchases. Again, right? Jumping into the pool on this stuff. Spot purchases year one, I think that's what we did, and we needed to figure this out. And then by the next year, I'd learned, oh, okay, to have real impact, I need to provide that signal that I'm going to be there for them 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So that was our next step. So it's all about not being afraid to take a step and go further. So I would say about 2/3 of our portfolio now is getting the credits, that we doing the credit transactions. But we also, there's a small startup called CGen out of the UK that's addressing critical need to have universal MRV in our oceans to enable marine CDR in the future. Like, that is really important, that before we go building a bunch of CDR solutions in the middle of the ocean, that we actually have a way to monitor what's happening. So they've got this really wonderful tech that we help them develop in their early stages, and we hope that that will one day enable scaling of marine CDR. So for us, it's not just about getting credits, it's about how can we have impact, and how can we have impact in a way that we can also communicate that's digestible to a broad public. We also, support some nonprofits that are doing some interesting things in the nature space. So I would say that it's a difficult question to answer because it's not all purchases, but that's the way we look at it.
Actually, it's interesting. I would echo something you said, which is um, very early on in your journey, buying some spot credits, right? And so that learning process. As a former trader, I always thought that the best way to learn something was to have a risk position, right? So small risk position,
Mhm.
but it focuses the mind and you learn much faster. So I would
Yeah.
always encourage people to think about dipping their toe into the spot market.
And it's also about relationships. I mean, this ecosystem, look at us on the phone. I mean, you've got all
Yeah.
sorts of different elements of this emerging market, and we have to be doing this collectively together. And so the ability I remember year 2 of our portfolio, I brought in one of our partners for a meeting with our CEO to talk about, some of the things we were thinking about, and that trust had been built. We had leadership support from the beginning, which was fantastic. And all of that comes together with, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do this. And it was a step-by-step approach. I don't know that I could have been successful in pitching to my leadership, hey, from the get-go, let's go in on these multi-year commitments to this thing called mineralization. It really required that trusted build of relationships, of understanding and education.
Yeah, and actually, I would also highlight that that's the interesting thing about this particular industry, right? Having come from one that wasn't always quite so collaborative, this one's extraordinarily collaborative, and everybody's willing to share their knowledge, which of course I'm always grateful for. So I think that's a very good point. Um, so Santosh, um, if Artemeter's running a private placement for Carbonetics 2025, 2026 deliveries, where does that leave carbon buyers who can only buy spot? Um, the market seems to be migrating to offtakes instead of spot. It seems like Carbonetics assets might be ones that won't touch the spot market. Is that a growing trend? How do buyers line up? Offtake
Yeah, I'd love
thoughts?
to get deep into that, but just briefly, I'm into touch with what Riley had said before. We all speak about when we talk about climate change and keeping the climate to under 1.5 or 2 degrees C. I mean, this is all we always speak about the end of the century, right? We want to prevent the global warming to beyond 1.5 degrees C by the end of the century. But an important aspect that is often not talked about is the overshoots. So to get there, it is likely in all the science climate models, we know that that's going to be an overshoot in the sense that temperature is going to increase between now and the end of the century higher and then going to settle down by the end of the century. And these overshoots create irreversible changes, right? Melting of ice caps and all these things are irreversible. So the reason we need more carbon removals today is not only to get to our end by 2100, but also to prevent those overshoots from happening, which can cause irreversible damage. So I just wanted to throw it out there because that's often overlooked, and we kind of miss the context of when we talk about why we need carbon removals today and not past in the future years. So shifting gears a bit now into the commercial side of things and talking about the placement process that Artemeter is running for Carbonetic, which is a superficial mineralization company. So just to lay out the context there, they essentially Carbonetic uses industrial byproducts like steel slag typically to kind of connect the superficial mineralization, and we are incredibly thankful to Google and Oliver Wyman, Lauren, and Reilly for being one of the early purchasers of these carbon credits and carbon removals from them, along with other institutions like Frontiers and Milky Wires, who have also been the early purchasers from Carbonetic. We at Artemeter are running the sales strategy for them, and we are right now running a placement process, a private placement process for Carbonetic credits, for the spot credits and the future credits, and which is going to conclude by end of this month, I believe. So if you're interested in participating in the placement process, and if you're watching this video, please reach out to me. But this is essentially trying to place these credits in a fair and transparent way in the market with interested buyers. Yes, we hope that this is going to essentially take all the planned capacity out of the market through these offtakes in the next 3 years. But yes, there is a scenario where we may not be fully subscribed to on the private placement, and there could be some spot trades we could bring into the spot market. But the idea behind running the placement process is not to keep things away from the spot market. I strongly believe we need a spot market. We need a secondary market to develop in this space that's going to be the true market of carbon markets, right? When we have the spot, we have these credits, and we can start hedging them. Or I mean, that's kind of my dream, that we would get to that place someday where you could be writing contracts and indexes against these contracts, against these credits, when you have a pretty good spot market available. But our idea of running the placement process is not to keep the spot away. The idea is that we want to give the developer that's carbonetic a very certain vision of what the capacity they need to plan for in the next 3 years on the back of promised offtake demands. And hopefully, they would be able to kind of get all their capacity into the private placement process and then scale up more to bring into the spot market. So that is the ultimate goal, and that's why we are running this private placement process, to give the certainty to the project developer so that they have certainty today about what's going to happen in the next 3 years. They can plan for that and go above and beyond and bring more spreads into the spot market on back of such increased demand that's coming from the placement process. So that's our vision of running, why we are doing this today. But again, as I mentioned, thanks to some of the early buyers who have kind of indicated the market interest for these credits, which kind of spurred this interest spurred this idea that we need to be running this placement process to take it to more number of buyers who may be interested in these credits.
Oh, thank you for that, Santhosh. And then hopefully, we'll have a new issue process on the Carbonplace platform, which may facilitate that and make that easy as well for other people. But that's a future state. Thank you for that. So the last question for all of you: what advice would you give the buyers who are looking at mineralization credits, perhaps for the first time? Is there anything about the project type that you wish you'd known sooner? Let me start with you, Lauren.
It's a good question, but I keep coming back to what Santhosh was just saying, and just an important point that this is really, when you step back, this is about resilience. And this is sort of this is a business strategy. This isn't, when I say we have a contribution model, for instance, it's not an altruistic, hey, let's do something good for the world. This is a business imperative for us, for our clients, for the world. So I think when you look at mineralization and you look at the scalability, that's why I think it's a winner. We are supporting right now mineralization and biochar because we think that, for all the reasons that the panel's talked about today, that those are two areas that we can feel the most confident about right now in our ability to achieve our goals. So there's plenty of other amazing pathways that everyone should be investing in, quite frankly. But for us, that ability, that accessibility, that simplicity, I think that's what interested me most, is the ability to give me that, aha, I get it, to understand the scalability, the durability, and then to be able to more easily pitch that to the decision makers.
Thank you. Reilly, your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe what I'd say is I'm glad it's not that I wish I'd learned more about mineralization sooner, but I'm glad I learned about it when I did, and that at this point in time, these solutions are coming online. I think the things that I find particularly exciting are all things I've said. The use of waste materials, the co-location, the low energy, all those things that I think, as you stack them up, build a really special and exciting pathway for removing carbon and permanently storing it. Maybe the one piece of advice I'd give is that we're still in such an early stage of what pathways will work. And I think that there is a feeling that I've heard expressed a lot, that it's impossible to diligence the full spectrum of carbon removal pathways. So Lauren has mentioned, starting out as a team of one, getting outside support. Like, a lot of folks can do that, and that's how it all starts. Team of one, enlisting outside support, building the program as you go. But maybe there are even folks who don't have that capacity or don't have that bandwidth. And I would just say, in those instances, I think turning one's eyes to existing leading registries, and then making sure that the protocols that set a really high bar for quality are the ones that you're chasing after with the solutions that you're looking at, is really important. So, maybe the other way of saying it is that groups like Isometric who have a mineralization protocol, that is a great place to turn to understand how this all works and to get high certainty of the impact that you're going to be claiming as a corporate buyer. So just to say that there is now an emerging landscape of groups that can be really helpful in cutting through the noise and figuring out what is quality and then providing some backstop is to the quality that you'll be getting. And so seek out those protocols, seek out those groups that help support by providing maybe, scientific expertise or diligence support. And then don't let just the novelty of these things, given that they're now fairly well established and becoming further established over time, don't let the novelty hold you back, because I think there's enough there to get to conviction relatively quickly, even for small teams.
And
No, I
don't
think
forget
that's great.
yourself, Reilly. I mean, we're the smaller buyers that don't have the big resources that Google has and Microsoft. I mean, we look toward the big purchasers with the big teams doing that incredible due diligence in-house with partners. Like we look at that signal too. So thank you, because it's I mean, it's in fact with Carbonetic, when we worked with Artemeter, they brought Carbonetic to us. We were very excited to be their first customer. Imagine how excited we were to hear that Google had also chosen. I mean, that was a big, okay, great. That's further validation. So it's really important to have the leaders like Google and Microsoft and the other big tech firms. But please, everyone else, think about how to make it work for you too, because it can't just be on their shoulders.
I was going to say, Lauren, given the timeline you just laid out, I should be thanking you for the early support of Carbonetic. But no, thanks for your.
And Santhosh, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know what more to add there, but yeah, I mean, definitely, as as Reilly said, think about the science and the permanence of these pathways. I mean, not to be dismissive about any pathway. I mean, we really need a lot of these solutions, and as Reilly said, there's no clear winner right now that we want to just back that and not the others. I think that's we probably need a lot many of them that are available today. But they all differ in terms of the intrinsic science and the permanence attributes. So if you're trying to build a portfolio, then you can always combine some of these more permanent mineralization credits with less permanent nature-based credits, and so understand the science and permanence behind these stats. And even within mineralization, as I mentioned, there is in situ mineralization, there's ERW, there's superficial mineralization, which is a player like Carbonetic. So they all differ very much. Understand the MRV techniques, because again, you need to look at what is being measured versus what's being modeled. I think that's a very important distinction, because as science develops, models develop, and things change, things get recalibrated. But measurement is pretty much ground truth many times. So like, it's mentioned earlier in this call, you measure something before it captures CO2 and after it captures CO2. Now you know exactly how much amount of CO2 your activity has gone into kind of removing from the atmosphere. So there's distinctions there. So do kind of be aware of these things as you get into some of these more novel, not just mineralization, but even more novel, like the marine CDRs that Lauren mentioned. That's definitely a high. I think has a very high caliber as a CDR pathway. But again, try and understand what are the risks around that. Then definitely that's the co-benefits factor. So, certain things like ERW are kind of, you put it in farmlands, for example, there's a co-benefit associated with that, or the nature-based solutions. So there's distinctions there. And finally, I would say delivery, right? Because we all want to be putting our dollars behind things that actually create an impact on the ground and not wasted. Yes, there's going to be some amount of waste, but we want to minimize that amount of waste as much as possible, so that the dollars really go into making that environmental impact that we desire. So looking at the delivery risk of technologies, looking at do they have the right partnership? Do they have the right capacity? Do they have the right capability in the outlook to be kind of pulling off this project? Is going to be very, very important. So that's, I would say that. And we are a friendly bunch in the carbon removals world. So I would say, don't hesitate if there's some question on the science or anything. Like I know Reilly is out there most of the time. I'm there. Lauren is here. So give us a call if you want to understand more about some particular pathway. We're happy to kind of tell you what we know and tell you what we don't. So.
I think that's actually that's a really good point and a great one to end on. And I'm mindful of time, and I know we have to stop, and sadly don't get a chance to get to the audience questions. But I think that the message I'd like to leave is to echo this one, which is, look, this is all super interesting, and the three of you are unbelievably generous with your time and the answers. So I would encourage our audience, if they need anything, to reach out to each of you directly if they need to, if they have questions. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all three of you for a great webinar. I wish you all a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Great.
Scott.
Thanks so much, all.
Bye.
Take care.